appreciate the crowd. I want to talk first of all about what I call the historic glow of Decatur, Illinois. Some communities in our country, some of them being large and some of them being small, have a historic glow about them. And for me, Decatur is such a place. Let me explain. If you ask most people, and perhaps all of you, if you thought about it, what is it about Decatur that makes Decatur a historic place? You might think, well, Decatur is where the Chicago Bears started. You might think, well, Decatur is the home of A.E. Staley Manufacturing, it's the home of ADM, it's the home of the Mueller Company. You might think of Decatur as the place that was the first place that Abraham Lincoln gave a political speech. You might think about the railroad explosion that happened in 1974. You might think about the 2 tornadoes that came in 2 consecutive days in 1996. And all of these things are true, but for me the true history of our city falls upon 2 things that are very much at the root of our industrial base here in Decatur. The first was the railroad. We had an east-west track coming through Decatur first, but it was the selection of Decatur as the site where the Illinois Central tracks would be laid, and more importantly would intersect with the east-west tracks, and that Abraham Lincoln played a very important role with the Illinois General Assembly in making Decatur the first site in the state of Illinois where you had east-west and north-south tracks intersecting. Decatur was a pretty small place back then. We're talking about the late, I think, 1840s. But that, in and of itself, made Decatur a likely place where businesses and industry would happen. And the second historic thing that happened here in Decatur was the development of coal mines. And that goes back to 1874, and then we had coal mines here until 1947. So that's a total of 73 years that we had productive coal mines here in Decatur.
Thank you.
Coal mining is not something that many residents of Decatur recognize as a major factor for the development of our community. But the role of coal mining was very significant to Decatur and actually to the state of Illinois. Let me explore with you not just the coal mines that existed in Decatur up to 1947 when the last mine was shut, but also why coal mining came to Decatur and why it left. We'll explore how big of an industry the coal mining was in Illinois and how big it remains today. And we'll talk about John Lewis, the legendary leader of the United Mine Workers, who actually lived in Springfield for much of his life and was buried there. Well, let's start with a general and brief discussion of the role of coal mining in our country. You can see John Lewis there. Coal mining was an industry in transition in the United States. The production of coal was down over 40% from its peak production in 2008. There was employment of 43,000 coal miners in the United States in 2008. But that's far from the 883,000 coal miners that were in the United States in 1923. Generation of electricity is the largest user of coal, being used for 50% of electric power in 2005, but it's down to 23% presently. Myself, I spend a fair share of my time in Mobile, Alabama, and every day that I'm there, I see trains carrying loads of coal. Coal car after coal car. And the reason is they're going to the docks, and the coal is being shipped to Europe. 7% of all the coal that is mined in the United States today gets shipped overseas. If I ask you what is the state that produces the great amount of coal today, what would you say? Does anybody have a guess? Where's the state where the greatest amount of coal is produced today? West Virginia. Okay. Anybody else agree with West Virginia?
I'd say PA.
Okay, yeah. Well, most of you would probably say West Virginia, but you would be wrong. Actually, Wyoming, by far, is the greatest producer of coal. Following in order behind Wyoming is West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and then Kentucky, and then Montana. Today, Illinois produces more than half of what is produced in West Virginia, which shocked me. Wyoming started with the Clean Air Act of 1990. The type of coal that's produced out in Wyoming is a much cleaner coal than what they produce in the Appalachian Mountains. And that was the real reason for the trend to go towards the west. And because they produced a cleaner coal, and once that move started, then in the 1990s there came exploration and the finding of large strains of coal out there. And 2 years ago, they found a new strain of coal out in Wyoming that they value at $37 billion. So if anything, Wyoming is going to continue to be an even greater source of coal in our country. Let me tell you another interesting fact, and that is that 8 out of the top 12 coal-producing companies in our country have been in and out of bankruptcy in the past 10 years. Well, let's turn the clock back now, and let's look at coal production when it first came here to Decatur. The first boring in Decatur was in 1874 by the Western Coal Company. It went down 507 feet, and they did not find a vein of coal thick enough to mine. However, they continued to drill, to bore down, and they did actually find 2 other strains of coal, one at 165 feet below the surface, and the other at 250 feet below the surface. So they found coal, and it wasn't very deep. Decatur businessmen thought that another effort should be made, and a Citizens Association of Decatur was formed, and they raised some money to continue to bore in the area, continue to look for places to mine. A local businessman named Lower Burroughs, through his brother, thought that his brother-in-law, J. Edward Baring, the name Baring may be familiar with some of you, who was out in Pennsylvania, was the man to be in charge of the boring. Mr. Baring was an engineer, although his main field was surveying for the railroad. But Mr. Baring came here, and actually Mr. Baring was one of the founders of the CB&Q Foundry, which stood on Jasper Street, north of El Dorado. Mr. Baring took over the exploration of coal here in Decatur. The first 2 bores occurred in the area of Jasper Street. The second discovered at a depth of 608 feet. So they found 2 veins that were relatively shallow. They found a 3rd vein that was much deeper. A shaft was built, and mining started. Later, another successful mine was sunk just south of the tracks in the Jasper Street vicinity. And still later, another mine just south of Prairie Street on Broadway. And then finally was the 4th mine, and that was on South Main Street. If you go on South Main Street today, and you go past Decatur Street, you continue going south, and you get pretty much at the bottom of the hill, and you look off to your left, you'll see where the coal mine used to be. That's where the entry place was for the coal mine. It has been reported, and you can see up here on the picture, you can see the existence of where these coal mines were. So you can see that they didn't do any coal mines underneath the downtown area because of the weight of the heavy buildings. They didn't want to put a coal mine underneath heavy buildings. So they're kind of doing it around the perimeter of what downtown would have been. And again, we're going back to the 1870s and 1880s. So you can see that we have coal mines over here on the east side of Decatur. And then here is the coal mine on the south side of Decatur. Now I will tell you with regards to this coal mine on the south side of Decatur, you'll see that some of it actually goes underneath Lake Decatur. They tried to be very cautious not to go underneath the dam. It has been reported that other mines were sunk in Macon County, including one near Niantic. The Niantic mine was owned by a company known as the Niantic Carbon Coal Company. It was formed in 1884 and was later owned by James Milliken. At one time, the Niantic mine was the second most productive mine in the entire state of Illinois. It had the capacity to produce 1,000 tons of coal per day, although 300 tons of coal was the usual daily production. It employed more than 100 coal miners. The mine had financial difficulties and was closed in 1924, although they made an attempt to reopen the mine in 1929, but that did not succeed. The shaft entrance for the Decatur Coal Company was situated off of Broadway between East Main and Prairie Streets. We're talking about just not even a block from where we're sitting, where we're at right now. It was sunk in 1882 and was fully operational by 1887. What was originally known as the Manufacturers and Consumers Coal Company and later as the Macon County Coal Company was situated at 700 South Main Street, as I said, at the hill below Decatur Street. There were more than 600 coal miners employed by mines in Decatur at certain times. There was over 350 miners employed at the Macon County coal mine alone, and this is not to include the miners who were employed out in Niantic. The coal produced by the mines was used in the furnaces of local industry, local schools, and homes. Decatur had several businesses which delivered coal to homes in the community. Brownie Coal Company at 840 North Morgan Street advertised in the newspaper as recently as 1967 that they would deliver coal to your homes. I don't know how many of you remember the coal chutes and the coal that would go down to fire up the furnaces down in the basements. There were accidents in the mines of Decatur. A newspaper article reported that 6 miners died at the Decatur Coal Mine Company in 1905 when a fire caused a collapse. There was a partial collapse of the Niantic mine in 1934 after it had been closed. The paper reported that it was a significant collapse, which they feared was going to cause a collapse of Route 36 near Niantic. Route 36 was not affected. Gustavus Pitts was a 70-year-old carpenter in the Macon County coal mine, and he suffered a skull fracture. There were other significant accidents that happened in the coal mines, in particular in the late 20s and in the 30s. There was one incident that happened, I believe, in 1934 when the elevator that would go down the shaft immediately collapsed and it would just dropped. And there were 10 miners that were in it, and all 10 of them got injured, but none of them died. There was an effort in 1955 to convert the site of that Macon County coal mine, which again, we're talking about South Main Street, to convert that area into a supermarket, a restaurant, and a service station. It was reported, it was in the front page of the newspaper. Everybody was hopeful that something was going to be made of that area down there, but it did not occur. If you talk to anyone that mined coal in the past 100 years, and you ask them who John L. Lewis was, they would know. John L. Lewis was famous enough that he was on the cover of Time magazine. By the way, I have a picture of some of the coal miners here in Decatur I'm going to pass around. John L. Lewis was born in Iowa. He came to Illinois in 1908 as a young person. He had already done some coal mining in Iowa, and when he came to Illinois, you can see John right there. When he came to Illinois, he returned to coal mining. He became the acting president of the United Mine Workers in 1919, still not that old, and that led to his leadership of the Coal Miners Union for most of his years up to 1960 when he retired. And in 1964, he was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Lyndon Johnson. Lewis called or inspired more strikes by coal miners than any other leader, and he was also responsible for many of the benefits given to coal miners, from their pay to their health benefits, their retirement benefits, and a lot of the safety measures in the coal mines. I mean, John Lewis, although he was an executive of sorts, considered himself to be a coal miner, and it was unusual for John Lewis, even though he was in his business suit, he'd go down in the coal mines, he'd come back up, and he'd be covered with coal dust. Here's the thing about John L. Lewis and his connection to Decatur. He lived in Springfield, Illinois for most of his life. His home, where he and his mother lived over there in Springfield, is on the National Register today. You can go and see where he lived at over there in Springfield. He was buried over there. He was buried at the Oak Ridge Cemetery, just a short distance from where Abraham Lincoln's tomb is. And due to his proximity to Decatur, John L. Lewis was a frequent visitor to Decatur and its coal mines. John Lewis was in all of the coal mines in Macon County himself. I was able to find a handful of articles in the Herald Review about John Lewis being in Decatur, and it wasn't unusual for John Lewis to either be at the mines or being in one of the cafeterias in downtown Decatur, and newspaper reporters would see him sitting there and they'd start interviewing him. And John Lewis was the kind of guy that if you sat down and started talking to him, he'd talk to anybody. So there was lots of interviews covered in our newspaper. In the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even the 60s, even after he retired, John L. Lewis walked the streets of Decatur, Illinois. Something that some of you may know and some of you may not know was that in the 1930s, there was a rash of bombings in central Illinois that was a result of turf wars between the United Mine Workers and the Progressives Union. There was also wars between the mine worker unions and the anti-union forces. This was all done more or less as a consequence of the bombing effort that was done in Kentucky in 1930, where they used an airplane to drop bombs on various mines down in Kentucky. And there were 6 people sentenced to federal prison out of this effort to use the airplane to bomb the mines, and one of the people came from central Illinois. From 1932 to 1938, there was more than 200 bombings in Illinois, which were related or alleged to be related to the strife between mine workers and anti-mine workers, or between the two mine workers unions. Christian County was the site of many of these bombings. Christian County was a very violent place in the 30s because of the number of coal mines that was down in Christian County and because of all the union activity that was going on there. There were 15 bombings of railroad cars in Christian County in the 30s. And of course, it was because the railroad cars were hauling so much coal. Decatur had as many as 10 separate bombings here in our community. Most of the bombings that happened in Decatur were bombings of homes, where they would bomb, for example, a man's name was John Beggs. John Beggs was in charge of the Macon County coal mine, and his home got bombed. Other people's homes were bombed here in Decatur. There was a huge criminal trial that took place in Springfield in the 30s, and it resulted in the conviction of 36 men. They had 36 men who were tried all at the same time in one trial, related to bombings that had occurred, and it was in federal court, so it was not just related to Sangamon County, it was a bigger area than that. But all 36 of these people were conspiring to do these bombings. All of this was a form of domestic terrorism before we even knew that term. The use of coal or coke, which is a form of coal, in the production of iron is important to understand the significance of coal to the Industrial Revolution. And with the increased number of foundries, the need for coal to be brought by rail to the foundries explains the reason why the foundries were always alongside railroad tracks, or the tracks were brought to the foundries when the foundries were under construction. This, plus the use of coal as an energy source, elevated coal as a very important resource in our country. And as I say, when the Clean Air Act of 1990 was passed, that increased the demand for low sulfur coal. And that's what they found out there in the Rocky Mountains, and that was at the expense of the Appalachian coal. West Virginia's coal production fell by more than a third in the 90s. And of course, as we saw the mines of West Virginia recede, we saw the mines of Wyoming prosper. Coal consistently accounted for 48 to 53% of the United States electricity generation all the way up to, from 1990. But then by 2008, coal had fallen to 37% of U.S. electricity generation. So obviously the amount of coal is falling. And by contrast, our natural gas share of electric production rose from 12% in 1990 all the way up to 30% in 2012 and continues to grow. It's the shale oil and gas boom that arose in the production of a big field in Texas and a big field, what they refer to as the Marcellus Shale region in West Virginia, which is producing a tremendous amount of natural gas. As a result of that, it's reducing the reliance upon coal. Still today, you see coal cars and trains as they pass through or come to Decatur. I couldn't find what percentage of rail traffic that comes through Decatur is coal, but that would be interesting. Certainly 20 years ago, it was much higher than it is now. Another interesting thing I found out about coal here in the state of Illinois, in 1979, a new state law was passed that required mine subsidence insurance, but it was determined that such insurance was not mandated for Macon County. When they passed the law, with a lot in the late 70s, there was a lot of concern here in Decatur, because people in Decatur knew that there was mines, abandoned mines underneath Decatur. People became very concerned about mine subsidence. It was a big concern in the state of Illinois, but there was a lot of concern here in Illinois, and most people were picking up the phone, calling their insurance man, wanting to know if they need to get mine subsidence insurance. And there was a period of days where the Decatur newspaper was running articles where they knew that the law had been passed, and they knew there was a lot of concern in the community about mines subsiding, but they didn't know if it was a problem here in Decatur. They decided that it was not a problem in Decatur, and so people didn't need mine subsidence insurance. However, I would also add that in the 30s and 40s, Decatur had several collapsed sewer lines on the city's east side, which were blamed on mine subsidence by state geologists. So we did have some problem with regards to mine subsidence on the east side of Decatur at one time. I'd also add that, as you saw the diagram with the Macon County coal mine, which goes underneath the lake in some places, and part of that was close enough to that railroad bridge that goes above Lake Decatur, beyond the dam, not too far. And there was concern that that railroad bridge might collapse, and so they, in the 70s, they pumped concrete down into that part of the mine to fill the mine. I don't know how much concrete they put in there, but it had to be a lot. also note that in my research and reading through the old Herald and Reviews, that it was pretty common in reading obituaries back in the 50s and 60s and even 70s, where you would read that somebody who had passed away, that they had worked in the coal mine at some point in their life. In summary, I would say that Decatur, for over 70 years, all the way up to 1947, was known as both a railroad town and as a coal town. And those two industries accounted for as much as 8,000 working jobs here in Macon County, and that is significant. One of the things that I brought along is a poster from World War II. This is a reproduction of the poster that shows the coal miner there. And the other thing I brought is, this is a real coal miner's helmet and goggles. This actually came from a coal miner in southern Illinois, and I couldn't find one from Macon County. And of course, the toolbox from coal miner. Not toolbox, lunchbox. Does anybody have any questions? Does anybody have any comments? Maybe you can correct something that I've said, or maybe you can add.
What was the deepest mine sunk? You know,
I don't know. I don't know the answer to
what
that.
the depth was.
I don't know the answer to that. I know that that they found veins as far down as a little more than 600 feet. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a possibility of getting a copy of that map?
A copy of
The map that shows where the
the
coal
map?
mines?
Yeah. I've got it here in my papers, and we'll figure out a way to get you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I suspect that there was coal in the area to see if it's.
How did they suspect that there was coal?
Yeah. I'm just curious.
Well, I'll tell you this. They've known that coal was here here in the state of Illinois since the days of Marquette and Joliet. You know, when they were explorers, they found coal, and the first coal mine, that underground coal mine that was dug in the entire state, was in Belleville before the Civil War. I think it was 1848. But with regards to here in Macon County, they really didn't know. They just were looking, because they looked at Decatur as a place where industry was going to happen, and they figured they needed coal. Yes, sir.
Here, a couple of comments. You said how many people you noticed, I guess they're obituaries, that they
Yes.
worked in coal mines. A couple of famous people from Decatur that worked in coal mines. One was the Hall of Fame pitcher, Joe McGinnity. And he was born in Springfield. His father was a coal miner. He moved to Decatur when he was a little kid. And he went to work as a child in the Decatur coal mines. So
Wow.
he worked during the day, played baseball, you know, afterwards, and of course went on to the Hall of Fame. And the other one that comes to my mind is
Good evening. May I have your attention, please? The time is now 7:30 p.m. The Decatur Public Library will be closing at 8 p.m.
Vito Bertoldo, who was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service in World War II. I believe he had been a coal miner for a while. Indicated.
Interesting.
I don't know if you had any comments on who were these coal miners?
Yeah, no, I really don't. I have two thoughts. First of all, part of my family came to Illinois from Kentucky, and they had been coal miners down in Kentucky. They came down, they came up as far as the area around Kinmundy and Pawnee, Illinois. And Grandpa really didn't want to be a coal miner.
Apologies for the feedback. As I was saying, the time is now 7:31 p.m. The Decatur Public Library will be closing at 8 p.m. For our patrons using our guest computers or our Wi-Fi, those services will automatically shut off in 14 minutes. Please plan accordingly. Thank you.
Anyway, Grandpa came up to live in Macon, Illinois, with the idea that he mine, and something I forgot to mention, was when they had the coal mines here in Decatur, I don't know if they used them all the way into the 40s, but for a long period of time, they used mules down in the coal mines. And I read an article in the Herald and Review by a woman who wrote a letter to the editor. This is in the 90s, but she remembered as a child that she had lived on a farm down in Macon. And she said that every summer they brought the mules out of the coal mines and they let them graze out there in the fields. And then at the end of the summer, they took the mules back down to the coal mines. And you saw in some of the pictures these mules that they had down there in the coal mines. Yes, sir.
My grandpa worked at the Macon coal mine. He had a small farm just south of there. He had little pastures, so they'd bring these donkeys out every so often and let them run the pastures. They would go blind and they'd just keep switching them out. He worked there till he retired.
How about that? Yeah.
And he's worked in the coal mine for 35 years when he retired.
You did?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
The Elkhart.
Oh, okay. Wow.
You work where?
Elkhart.
Elkhart.
Still going strong, yeah.
Yeah. How many people worked at the Elkhart mine?
There was, at the highest point, there were 320. And the seam layer was 300 feet. And further east or west you go, it gets more shallow. And down south it gets steep. But it's the same coal seam as all of that, or Illinois is coal, and that falls in one state.
And where did most of that coal go? The Elkhart?
Springfield. Springfield, Peoria, ADM. Springfield was the main thing they took.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, Chuck?
I had two comments. One, when I was probably in the late 50s or the 60s, my father always pointed out the coal mine. And it had been abandoned for years, I suppose, but the stipple, or whatever that thing is called, is
Yes.
still there.
Right.
Right where
Yeah.
the element power stuff is.
Yeah, yeah.
The second thing is I worked part-time at Staley's in the summers, and I worked with the coal dock. And they would bring, trailers full in all day, and I would tell them to park here, dump it there, dump it there. It was, they were very reliant on coal at that time. And now it's all natural gas, I guess.
Yes, sir.
Are there any other remnants of the mine entrances aside from the one you said there on South Main?
Well, Chuck just mentioned one over,
Just right here. block
South of Tate
Yeah.
Mile.
You can't see it.
Right, so I worked in that railroad next to Tate Mile, and I've walked around up there, and I know there's a mine entrance there, but there's nothing left to show is there.
There's one there at Christie Falls. It was open for years.
right, that's the one that's from South
Yeah.
Main, 700 South Main. Yes, sir.
I know that near the end of that history, there was before the two companies combined, there was two independent companies. There was one you mentioned, the Decatur and Macon County Coal Company. I think there was a Decatur Coal Company.
There was a Decatur Coal Company and a Macon County Coal
Yeah.
Company, yes.
And
That's right.
they each had two shafts. They had a main shaft, as you mentioned, that was like a vertical shaft. But they had an escape shaft. Each of them had an escape shaft.
I didn't know
It was
that.
rarely used, and one of them, I don't remember which company it was like a diagonal shaft that emerged somewhere in the East Wabash yards. I don't know exactly where it was. That was one of the emergency shafts, and then the other company had one as well. So there were at least four shafts that were present.
Are any of the coal mine shafts underneath any of the parks in a town, like in Fairview or Nelson?
I don't know the answer to that. I
My
would-
son works for the park district.
Okay, I wouldn't be surprised if there is some of the
The
coal
temptation to stick
shaft
by
that
most
goes.
places is.
Yeah, he
rather
gets
strong.
curious, he'll see things that are odd, and he'll get curious and start.
Especially Nelson,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, me and a friend have been looking to a lot of Decatur history, especially under Decatur.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting. Yes, ma'am.
I know that, in a lot of coal mining areas, immigrants would move in. Did we see that in Decatur?
That's an interesting question. when my grandparents came to Decatur, they were both immigrants, and they lived in the area around the Wabash Depot. I wonder if there weren't a lot of homes in the proximity of the coal mines, and that the immigrants would live in some of those homes and they were going to work in the coal mines.
Yeah.
I suspect. Would you say?
I think so. I think a lot of the East El Dorado Street was apartments. A lot of immigrants lived in those apartments, and I suspect, I haven't researched this thoroughly, but I suspect that early on it was Irish that were primarily the coal miners, and then later Italians.
Yeah. I grew up in north central Missouri, and there was a lot of coal mining. And it's amazing how in these little towns of 300 or 400 people, there's a lot of Italian surnames. And they came in for the coal mine. So they would specifically move to those areas, whole families.
They had their own little areas. Grandma come over from Italy. Italians were here, Polish people were here, and they all just kind of kept separate. They all got along, but they had separate areas where they lived.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Are they monitoring any of these underground mines for fear of future collapse?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. Curious about it.
Yeah. I know, sinkholes, that's what I was worried about.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Oh, wait a minute. We got one more comment. Yeah.
So I don't know if I think maybe you've done some research or you're aware of the various springs that were around. I don't know. There was one that was in Fairview Park, right?
Okay, yes.
And there was another one that was right near the south of Decatur, near the coal mines, that was for a while like a resort area, with this spring water for a few years.
So what you're referring to, there's that area, and I'm trying to remember the name of the neighborhood. There's a park there. Greenwood.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So there was a spring that was there, and then in the 20s, when they were putting in the sewer system in Decatur, the sewer system got into the spring. That was the end of the spring. But up to that time, the people that lived in that area probably had the cleanest water of anybody in Decatur.
I know at the time, both of these springs disappeared, but at the time, people didn't really know why they disappeared. So there was some speculation that, oh, it must have been mines that interfered with it, but nobody really knew.
I think one thing I found interesting in my research of the 10 worst coal mine disasters in our country, 2 out of those 10 happened here in the state of Illinois. And one, I think, was a place called Cherry Hill, maybe, and there was like 259 people killed. And then the other one, I think, was in Centralia. And I don't remember how many people were killed in Centralia, maybe over 100. And of course, there was the Moequa mining accident that I think happened in the 1930s, maybe. And I don't remember how many people died in Moequa, but it was quite a disaster.
I think that was Christmas Eve.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody coming.